What's up, guys, and welcome to the theScore eSports podcast. As per usual, I am your host, Colin. In the booth with me behind the boards, we got Daniel Rosen.
Once again, emergency guest technician.
But you're doing a great job. Take it from me.
Thank
To my left is not Josh Burry. It's not Keith Kapsick. It's not Sean Wetzlar. We've got, for one of the few times in this podcast history, a guest in the studio with us, and that is Chris Overholt. He is the CEO of OverActive Media. If you don't already know, they hold the Toronto Overwatch League spot. Chris, welcome to the theScore eSports podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure. We love having guests in the studio. Like we said, it rarely happens unless there's a big esports event in Toronto, which again, rarely happens. But maybe now that you guys are in town, slightly more often.
Yeah, no, just down the street. We're not actually sure where we're going to be set up yet, but it won't be far from here. So we'll be around a lot with you guys.
Well, it sounds good. Now, you guys, by which I mean the Toronto spot, were announced with a bunch of others, 8 in total for 20 teams in the league. Can you tell us any details about the naming process or the branding process? Because we don't have any of that yet, right?
We're going right into that, are we? Well, look, we want to make sure we do that right. You only get a chance to launch once. We want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that makes sense to our fans. And, in just 5 days, we've managed, with the support of all of those who are watching, we've gathered up 10,000 followers against our Toronto Overwatch League call to action on Twitter. So we're off to a good start here, and we want to make sure we honor that. So we're working hard. We've got some people, of course, at Splyce that are involved. We got another group at an agency that we've been working with who is absolutely authentic to the space, and we'll have more to talk about in the next few weeks.
So I want to get to some of the stuff you mentioned, Splyce, Toronto, in a little bit, but I am curious as to how the whole process works in terms of naming, because I've been told that it's Blizzard who sort of hands down your visual identity as an Overwatch team. Is that correct?
Well, no, actually. They've been amazing to work with and only supportive in all of it, but they're really encouraging us to do the work and to be engaged with them for sure for guidance, but really just a supportive piece of that process to us. And we had a great call with Jeff Kaplan and his team just last Friday, actually, which was frankly a real honor for me. That guy's a legend in the industry, of course, and we were all kind of lamenting the fact that we're celebrating the fact that we were on the phone and would be able to tell our kids that we were on the phone with Jeff Kaplan. It's pretty funny. But the process has been helped by them and informed by them, but we've got our own team of people working on it as well. So
you're going to propose a name to Blizzard, and Blizzard presumably gives it the yes or no kind of thing?
We're going to work together on it, and
Okay.
That's the process that we've started. And then, of course, the other thing you've got to do is clear trademarks. And, there's barely an original idea left out there anymore, so that's a process in itself.
This is true.
I was curious, before we kind of get into, obviously, like the team nitty-gritty stuff, you're obviously pretty new to the esports space, at least from the outside looking in. I don't know your personal history with it, but, obviously you were with the Olympic Hit Committee, and then for a long time you were with various hockey teams. I think the Panthers and the Leafs or MLSE. I'm wondering if you could talk a little about your personal history and what's bringing you to esports.
Yeah, so a great question, Daniel, and perfectly appropriate to today. It's my personal history with esports has really been only developing over the last couple of years. I mean, I have 2 sons who are 24 and 22, so I've certainly watched them and participated with them growing up. I'm terrible, but they're going to bring me along a little bit faster, I think, in the coming weeks and months. But I really started paying attention to the space a couple of years ago. I was actually introduced through friends in the United States. I was introduced to the Activision Blizzard team. Spent quite a bit of time talking to them. Would have been early part of 17, I guess, late part of 16. And I was approached on the basis of learning more about what the Overwatch League was and how they were developing it and the way they were thinking. And spent quite a bit of time with them. So that really sparked my interest in the space, and watching Overwatch come on board was obviously something that I was keen to do. But my tie back to all of this actually came through a relationship that I started 20 years ago with Sheldon Pollack, our chairman of OverActive Media. So Sheldon, you might know, has been a longtime innovator, investor in the tech space. He actually, in the mid to late 90s, owned a company called Onyx. And at that time, I was working in the tech space with digital. And so we came to know each other a little bit then, and then reconnected when I came back to work at the COC. And then he called me out of the blue in May and just said, hey, we're looking at something over here. I wouldn't mind your perspective on it. Can you come by the office tomorrow? So I swung by and we got talking about it. And once I realized that it was an Overwatch franchise, I certainly was hooked in. And we spent the next few months kind of working on it. And then I was part of the pitch to Pete and his team at Overwatch. So it's all just kind of rolled from there.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, I have to ask, when you guys do come to Toronto, we don't know exactly when that will be, by which I mean physically, when the expansion teams and the first teams actually play in their own markets. Have you started looking at that at all, where you're going to play, what that's going to look like? Yeah,
I mean, we had to start to think about that as part of talking to the league about the bid. So as we were preparing, how we would, how we'd position the franchise, how we would roll with it, we also had to talk to them about available venues that we could play in when the time came. So we've started to look at that. We've actually had some conversations with some of the local venues. So we're not quite there yet. And when the time comes and we have to be ready, I'm confident we will be. I will also tell you that as an ownership group, we've talked a lot about what it's going to mean to establish esports in Toronto and Canada. And, when I worked at the Raptors in the late 90s, a big part of, I think, establishing that franchise was also establishing them in their own home. And so while we certainly aren't definitive in that way, we're already talking about what it could mean. And we do think that at some point we're going to take a step toward building our own home for our own franchise.
Right. And when it comes to putting butts in those seats, when and if you do build your own, or if you rent another venue, how exactly do you guys plan at this stage to endear yourselves to local fans? Because often in esports, that's not a concern. They don't have home stadiums. They have home regions, right? But you guys are going to have to somehow sell tickets, somehow get a number of Toronto people interested in the team. And with 20 teams to choose from, it might be difficult to distinguish yourself.
Well, you might be right, but a couple of things. And in fact, this is a large part of the reason I'm involved in this. I've had this experience before. I know what it means to sell tickets for franchises. It's been most of my career, either or both of working on ticket strategies or marketing and sponsorship strategies. We will probably be talking about developing season seat base and starting to think about getting engagement from a fan perspective as early as this year. I can't imagine a scenario where we come through 2019 and we're not talking to our local fans about starting to engage them in the idea of actually being at a game or at a match when we're ready to go here in Toronto. So a big part of that, as you point out, is first securing that venue. But then starting to think about how we encourage that. Of course, our region is quite broad. We stretch all the way east to Kingston, all the way down to London, Ontario, and then south into the regions around Syracuse and Buffalo and Rochester. So we'll have a big region to draw on, bigger than most teams that play in local markets. Otherwise, you'd be somewhat restricted. And we'll do that engagement, affect that engagement, I think, in a number of ways. There'll be a group of fans that are close enough, and by that I mean within perhaps 2 or even 3 hours drive, that will make our matches, our live experience, a priority for themselves and participate in it. We think just like sport fans would, and then there'll be our fans at distance, not just outside of our region, but at distance in and globally. And we're going to want to think about different ways that we can do that too.
So is it like you will build it, they will come kind of idea? Because I know early on in OWL, I heard some grumblings about certain teams who they performed really well. I'm just going to say NYXL, I heard this a lot about. They were always top of the standings, exciting to watch. But from what I was told, were very absent in terms of fan engagement. They weren't holding the viewing parties. They weren't reaching out to people effectively on social media. And we had other teams who maybe were on the other end of the standings, and you'd have these great shots where there'd be a bar full of people in their colors, right? And the difference to me there was quite stark. Do you guys have your mind on that at all?
Yeah, we absolutely do. Look, this is there are many layers and many dimensions to building a fan base that is loyal and authentic to what you're trying to do, and all of those things that you're pointing to are a big part of that. So we certainly expect to build out and engage our fans in a way that makes sense to them in the ways that they want. They're certainly going to want to meet our players and our coaches. They're certainly going to want to have some exposure and to each other. They're going to want to celebrate the franchise in person, and we're going to want to create moments for them to do that. Our fundamental bread and butter, I think, will be the way we engage on social and the way we engage digitally every day to keep that conversation going and to collect their feedback. And then we're going to want to create moments of inflection for them around the brand, around the team, and around the event that is the Alive experience. And all of those things that you mentioned are going to be core to that, I think.
Let me ask you this. Sorry, Dan. I keep
worries.
like interrupting you here. I'm just like, I'm on a roll because now I want to ask you something that prior to the franchise launch of the NALCS earlier this year, so when they were about to go franchise, we did a big run with as many team owners and coaches and people who had the franchise spots as we could. And one thing that I always asked every single one of them was, well, how are you going to endear yourself to fans? And the answer almost always came back as, well, we're going to win. We're going to win. Winning is certainly the most effective way in esports to gain notoriety, at least at the beginning. But it was my difficult duty to break it to those owners that not everyone can win.
Sure,
that's just a matter of math,
sure.
Right? So for you guys, what does the target look like? Is it winning, or, and I'm finally getting to my roundabout point here,
Okay.
Do you view things like team composition as in, do we have personality on the team? Do we have guys who are going to make content with us and connect with fans on a more personal level? Is that on your radar at all?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I'm 100%. Winning can't be for everyone for the reasons you point out. Being perennially competitive can be something that you aspire to. And then, there's a lot that goes into a winning season. There's a lot that goes into a championship season, and that goes to matters of health and matters of, the effort that is prescribed in what it means to be practicing your craft and all of those things, and the team dynamic that goes on inside the team and the support that you offer those players. So a couple of things about that. First of all, again, Marty and his team at Splyce know this and know how to do this really well. And certainly the exposure I've had to the Splyce team would suggest that we're going to be real pros in this from the beginning. Marty's got a plan in front of me right now in terms of the way we're going to manage our team, develop our team, frankly, treat our players, and the way we think about how we support them across what I think is a fairly long season to be mentally switched on the way you need to be competitive in this all year long. So we've got a really good plan there, and I'd like to think that that'll be some of how we set ourselves apart in the free agency market and generally with the players that are available. On the other side, again, you want to be competitive, and you want to be competitive from day one because you want your fans engaged around all of that. But the part that you're pointing us to is the most important part. And we talked about it before we even came on air. Accessibility, transparency, a freedom of information that flows back and forth toward your fans, chances to engage, chances to chime in. And that gets done at all levels and needs to be done. Starting with me as a leader of the organization. But, again, Marty and Splyce and his team are going to be part of that. And you've seen some of that in our social handles already and the way we've been engaging our followers. We've been talking to them, I'd like to think, and they'll tell us, but we've been talking to them in ways that I think early on have made sense to them. And we're trying to be really available and keeping them really current on the information as it flows. So, we announced our general manager, Jay, earlier in the weekend. We announced Coach yesterday. We're on the edge of some new player developments that I'm sure we'll have to share in the next coming days. But all of that's going to be method of operation for us. We need to be accessible in that way. I think that's the way you first engage. That's also the way you sustain and grow. You can't win every year. That's just a fact. But you can always be connected, and you can always be, again, authentic in the way that you drill down with your fans. So we're going to try and do that.
So
and I'm sure they'll tell us if we're not doing it.
Oh, they will.
Yeah.
Sorry for hopping in before you finished answering. I wanted to hop on that before asking something about Splyce. Something that you mentioned before was obviously you're talking about, creating an identity with the Raptors. They are Canada's only basketball team, right? So there was the identity. I think they have found one, especially in recent years. I talked to a lot of Overwatch League, either the team owners or members of the ownership groups leading up to the first season. I think all but 2 or 3 of them. And a question I asked a lot was, how are you going to be this authentic? Everybody brought up authenticity, like you're bringing it up now. It's the most important thing in if not esports, in sports, right? Being authentic to your market, being authentic to your fans. I want to know, because you don't have the advantage that, say, the Raptors do of being Canada's team. There's going to be a Vancouver team. Mm-hmm. There was no Canada team prior to this in the Overwatch League. Now there are 2. What does it look like to be authentically Toronto's team? Because we're used to losing teams, right? Colin McNeil is a long-suffering Leafs fan. We're used to it.
Oh, suffering no more, my friend.
That's right. The new era. You know what? I think that's a great question, and I think the I'll remind you that the Raptors weren't the only team in Canada at the time, right? They were
peace,
launched
Grizzlies.
with the Grizzlies at the same time. And it was only after the Grizzlies moved to Memphis that they really started to take up that moniker, change their colors to reflect the nation's team and so on. But we did start with intention to be positioned in that way. And again, I don't know whether you would remember, but in those days, we used to take the team on the road in the preseason. We'd go out and play preseason games in places like Halifax. We traveled with the team and into communities so that the players and the franchise and those that were attached to it could have exposure, not just inside Toronto, but even outside our region and across the country. Again, authentic isn't something that you are. Authentic is something that your fans tell you are, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that just goes to how you draw that connection and the intention that you offer it from the beginning. We've spent a ton of time as a group, those of us that are working on this, and just over the last couple of weeks, talking about what Toronto is, talking about, from all of our individual perspectives, what Toronto stands for, what the region stands for, So it's not just about us, it's about our fans in Rochester. And, how do they think about Toronto and how do they think about what they want their team to be? Again, our fans in Kingston. But it's insofar as it's Toronto's team, we've been quite intentional in our conversation about making sure that we feel that the brand story that we're developing around it and the values that we demonstrate in the way that we conduct our business, in the way that we go about leading the franchise and executing our mission, feels like Toronto and feels like our fans. So we've talked for a lot about this part of the city, Queen West and some of how that has come to be a bit of the brand that is Toronto. We've talked a lot about its, again, it's an urban dwelling that you live in and enjoy. We've talked a lot about the feeling that emanates from the youth in this city and how in many ways we think it's starting to be defining about how we're viewed internationally. All these things matter. And again, we aspire not just to have fans in Toronto and in our defined region. We aspire to have fans globally. I would like for a fan in Hong Kong or a fan in Seoul, Korea, to, even though he or she's never been here before, have some level of understanding what it means to be in Toronto or to be a Torontonian when you watch us, play, when you watch us demonstrate and grow the brand over the next few years. So I think it's going to be a great challenge. I think it's going to be great fun.
So the other thing I want to ask you about is jumping off something else you mentioned. You brought up Marty. Oh goodness, I'm always so bad at pronouncing his last name, but Marty from Splyce, who people know on Twitter as, I believe, Laser Chickens.
That's right.
And I want to preface this by saying I have nothing against Splyce. They, however, are they're not a Toronto-based organization,
sure.
right? They are, I think, Rochester, right? And right. I'm curious, what are they bringing to the table, right? Because they aren't necessarily that Toronto organization, and Splyce, while being a big organization, is perhaps not one of the biggest esports organizations in the world. So I'm curious what they're doing, because I do think Splyce does some really good work out there. I've been in this space for a long time. I've seen them grow. I'm curious, what are they bringing to the table in these conversations?
Yeah, great question, and I think easily answered in describing our ownership group and the way we went about building this group. So, in quick terms, we have Sheldon Pollock is the chairman of OverActive Media, and he's a longtime tech investor and innovator in this city. Adam Adama, who's a venture capitalist and who's a trendsetter and a trend follower and trying to always trying to stay ahead on all of that. The Kimmel family, great longtime retail entrepreneurs and very, very successful, and Mike Kimmel in particular, really growth minded and thinks big. And then as we were putting the rest of that puzzle together, there were two things that we thought were essential to our success and credibility as a franchise. The first was we needed to find people and experts who knew the space and knew how to operate in the context of what it means to operate an esports organization and a team. And that's not naturally inherent here. We wanted to be instantly kind of in that game and make sure that we could have the potential to be competitive from the get-go. And we didn't think we could afford, frankly, to spend the next 3 years kind of developing that talent. And we had an interested partner in Marty and his group at Splyce. So Splyce is actually an investor in the organization. They're a shareholder in OverActive Media, and we are in Splyce. So they're partners, and we are in their business. And they bring that expertise and acuity to everything that they do in that. And then the last piece of it was me. And again, this league has been purpose-built for esports. It's been built with the NBA and the NFL as a model. And I've worked in both of those leagues, and I have the experience and know what it takes to build, sports brands. And with the help of many over many years, I've had experience of driving ticket sales and sponsorship and everything else. So when you mix all of that together, we just thought that was the best chemistry and the best group to come together to really get this thing going right.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, I want to apologize. I'm sure Marty will eventually listen to this. Get back to him. I'm sorry that I can't pronounce your last name. It has escaped me. He gave me an interview once that really, honestly, was very helpful to me. So I feel bad for forgetting how to pronounce his last name. But the last thing I wanted to ask with regards to this, and in terms of like the ownership groups and stuff, is a little bit about sort of what I guess is at the moment where the money is coming from, because you have mentioned the ownership group, but it's a lot of investment. And I'm wondering, is a lot of this, however much you can say about it, I'm sure it's difficult to talk about, is a lot of this private investment, or is this a lot of, partnerships being made behind the scenes that can't necessarily be talked about yet?
Well, the first thing you know is that we are very, very well capitalized with a great group of very passionate owners and very committed to what we're doing here. So again, those that I mentioned and other investors that we do have, but it's all been private investment, and as such, we're a private organization, and so we'll have to leave it at that for now. But we're certainly not done either. Like I said earlier, very growth-minded in the way we're thinking about this. We're investors in other related companies. We have share interest in a company called Ascot Entertainment, which is an online gambling platform that's been developed. Enthusiast Gaming, we have shares and interest in that as well. And as I said earlier, we're already cross-invested with Marty and his team at Splyce. So, and we also know that this is going to be ever-evolving space, that there's going to be new opportunities in it, perhaps new leagues and new franchises to consider for Toronto, and we want to be on the front end of that conversation every time that opportunity shows itself. So we'll see how it goes. Obviously, we're fiercely focused right now on launching Overwatch Toronto, and that's where we're going to keep our attention for now. But there'll be more to come in the years ahead. We're excited about what it looks like.
Well, Chris, you kind of did my job for me there in terms of the transition, so I have to thank you for that, because I did want to tack on a question actually about the other properties that Overactive Media has interest in. You mentioned Ascot Entertainment. You mentioned the TO that organizes EGLX. There's also two news, gaming, tech-oriented news sites, I believe, Destructoid. What's the other one?
The Escapist.
The Escapist. Do those properties have any connection, or will have any connection to the Overwatch League franchise, or are they because they all orbit around that sort of gaming sphere, or are they completely separate interests?
So those are interests of Overactive Media, of which I'm the president and CEO, and then the Overwatch League and the ownership of the franchise here in Toronto is engaged by those that I just mentioned. But what it speaks to is our vision for this company and for this organization, and our fans should be excited about that in this context. If we're going to be great owners of our Overwatch franchise and great stewards of the brand that we'll build with their help, then we need to be, again, thinking long-term about the growth in this space and providing leadership. When I was at Maple Leaf Sports, Richard Petty used to always say to me, the lead brand has a responsibility bigger than everyone else. The lead brand has a responsibility to move the industry and to be on the front end of some of the things that show up as innovations. And we really feel like we're about to become a lead brand in all of what we're doing here in Toronto around Overwatch. And so, again, we're going to do our level best to provide good leadership in all ways.
Absolutely. So in terms of using, you maybe you don't know this yet, but will you be using the resources of those other properties to boost the Overwatch League team at all? Like, I'm sort of fantasizing about people who work in content for the two news sites, creating content that is pointed towards the Overwatch League team.
Yeah, it's too early to tell exactly how all of those interests will shape themselves around our principal focus right now. But look, we're going to, I think the point really is that we're going to take every available opportunity to grow and develop and engage our fans in this brand and in this franchise, figure out ways to do that best and to reach new fans as they come across from the mainstream and start to take on eSports. We're going to look to find different ways to engage with all of them.
Okay, Chris, I got you in front of me now. You are the former CEO of the Canadian Olympic Committee. This is something we talk about so much in esports, and we never have someone who's appropriate to ask about it. So I'm just going to drop it on you. Could esports ever be in the Olympics / should they be in the Olympics?
So I think that's an evolving conversation, but I think it's on the right road. I was invited in June by the IOC to a 2-day conference that was hosted by Thomas Bach and Rick Fox. that was all about esports. So it brought the esports global community together in Lausanne, Switzerland, and hosted 2 days of content. We had players there, we had coaches, we had international federation leaders, we had Thomas Bach and Rick Fox, who, as you know, is a team owner. And 2 days for everybody to kind of get to know each other and to understand the issues and the opportunities. And then we've since seen, just a week and a half ago, the Asian Games hosted esports as a demonstration sport. And in the very same week, we saw Thomas Bach say, no immediate plans for engagement. Here's what we do know. It is the case that aspiring cities who want to host winter and summer games in a new part of new development in terms of the way the IOC is rolling out those opportunities for potential host cities, those cities have the opportunity to define their program unique and appropriate to the city and to the country that they're hosting in. So as an example, we're going to see skateboarding and surfing in Tokyo, where we've never seen either of those sports as a part of the Olympic program before. So the answer to your question, I think, is just that, an evolving one, but I think the trends point to the right direction. And here's one last thing. I think France has already indicated that there's no intention for 24 where esports is concerned, but certainly LA would make a lot of sense for at least that to be a possibility considered. Some of those that are on the inside of organizing LA 28 are connected to this industry in ways that are obvious and your listeners could figure out for themselves. But I do think that this will be a conversation that continues. And I think as the space continues to evolve and mature, and as the IOC clearly starts to understand more deeply just what a huge opportunity this is to connect with young fans of sport and of esport, I think it'll be really interesting to watch in the next couple of years.
I actually did not realize that so much power or onus was placed on the hosting city. I sort of imagine the IOC, dropping commands on high on whoever hosted it.
This is all part of their Agenda 2020, which was rolled out when Thomas Bach took over as president, and what they refer to as the new norm as it goes to the normal procedure for host cities to contemplate. And of course, I'm living this real time right now because we've been working on Calgary as a potential host city in 2026. So we'll see how it goes. But I can tell you that the IOC is fiercely committed to their new norm strategy. And so to the extent that we have cities and countries that are interested in propagating the esport conversation for the Olympics, the IOC will, I'm sure, be good to that conversation.
All right. Well, we look forward to when and if that ever does come to fruition. Chris Overholt, CEO of OverActive Media, who hold the Toronto Overwatch League spot. We're about out of time, so I'm just going to thank you so much for making time and coming down to the physical office, which is a rare treat for us, for the theScore Esports podcast.
My pleasure. Anytime, guys, really.
All right. Well, we definitely appreciate it, and hopefully we hear, like you said, hopefully hear more about those player announcements soon. I'm looking on some people. You guys have that just an exclusive window, right, for free agents for you guys?
Yeah, it started Sunday, and Marty and his team have been preparing for a while prior to that. So we stay tuned. More news soon.
All right. We look forward to it. Guys, that's all from us here at the theScore Esports podcast. For Dan, for the absent Josh Burry, I'm Colin McNeil saying thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. GG.